I used to think Christmas was the safest place in the world. The Reed family living room glowed with a kind of warmth I thought could never fade, soft golden lights wrapping around the pine tree, cinnamon in the air, my mother's laughter echoing from the kitchen, and the comforting hum of carols that played year after year. Back then, the table was always full, every chair taken, every story shared. Back then, I still belonged. But belonging, I've learned, isn't permanent. It's fragile, like an ornament that can shatter with a single careless touch. The first year my family forgot to invite me, I convinced myself it was a mistake. Maybe they'd lost my number, or maybe the group chat had changed, and someone simply forgot to add me. I waited by the phone that Christmas Eve, half-wrapped gifts sitting by the door, convinced my sister would call and say, "Tay, are you coming or what? We saved your seat." The call never came. I tried to brush it off, told myself I was being dramatic, that people get busy. But the next year, the same silence returned. And then the next. Until it became a pattern so familiar that the hurt almost felt routine. Every December, I watched my family gather through the filtered glow of their social media posts. Matching sweaters, wine glasses raised, smiling faces under twinkling lights. Always captioned, "Everyone's here. Everyone except me." That phrase used to echo in my head like a cruel refrain. I'd scroll through the photos and search for any sign they missed me, a glance, an empty chair, maybe even a single comment that said, "Wish Taylor could have come." But there was nothing. Not even my name. It wasn't like I had done anything wrong. Unless being honest about who I am counted as wrong in their eyes. The year I told them I was intersex, my mother's face fell, as though I had confessed a crime. My father went quiet, retreating into that cold silence that only he could manage. My sister hugged me, but it felt like she was comforting a stranger. That night, no one said much. We just ate in uneasy silence, the sound of forks against plates louder than words. A week later, my mother texted me, "We love you, but this is hard for us to understand. Give us time." Time, I gave them plenty. What I didn't know was that time would turn into years, and that love, in our house, had conditions I could no longer meet. By the fourth Christmas, I stopped decorating. The boxes of ornaments stayed sealed in the closet. The lights that once brightened my apartment window gathered dust. Instead, I spent the evening wrapped in a blanket on the couch, the TV glowing faintly in a room too quiet for comfort. Outside, the city glimmered with celebration, but I sat in the dark, a ghost at my own holiday. Sometimes, I'd catch my reflection in the window and barely recognize myself. There was a tiredness in my eyes that hadn't been there before, a kind of stillness that comes only from waiting for people who will never come back. But that particular year, last year, something shifted. It was December 24th. Snow fell in lazy swirls outside, the kind that looked beautiful from a distance, but bit through your coat the moment you stepped outside. I'd made a cup of cocoa, more out of habit than cheer. And then, against my better judgment, I opened my phone. My sister had posted again. The family gathered around the same table, same garland, same golden lights. They all looked older but happy. The caption read, "Another perfect Christmas with everyone." That word again. Everyone. I stared at it until the letters blurred. The photo wouldn't stop glowing, like a wound that refused to close. I could almost hear the laughter, the clinking of glasses, the familiar sound of my mother humming while serving pie. All of it still existed, just without me. That realization hit harder than it should have. I wasn't forgotten. I was erased. Quietly, neatly, completely. I turned off my phone and sat there in silence. The cocoa had gone cold. For a long moment, I didn't move. The hum of the radiator was the only sound in the apartment. And then, something unexpected happened. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it suddenly all felt absurd. I'd been holding my breath for years, waiting for people to remember me, as though my worth depended on their invitation. I'd built my life around the empty chair they left behind. That laugh was sharp, almost bitter, but freeing. I looked around my apartment. It was small, cramped, and half-lit by the dying glow of a single lamp. But in that moment, it felt like mine again. Not a waiting room for a life I'd been denied, but a place that belonged to me, however temporary. I stood, walked to the window, and watched the snow gather on the railing. Each flake melted as it landed, tiny, brief, beautiful. I whispered to myself, this can't be it. This can't be all there is. And that's when the idea began, quietly, like a flicker in the dark. What if I stopped waiting to be included? What if I built something for myself, somewhere no one could take it away? That night, I opened my laptop. I wasn't sure what I was searching for at first. Maybe a distraction. Maybe a dream. But the moment I saw the listing, secluded cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains, perfect winter retreat, something in me clicked. The photos showed a small wooden house surrounded by endless trees, smoke curling from the chimney, snow blanketing the roof like a quilt. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't big. But it looked peaceful. Untouched. Real. I don't know what possessed me to do it. Maybe exhaustion, maybe hope. But by midnight, I'd filled out the inquiry form. My hands were shaking, heart pounding. It felt reckless, impulsive, like leaping into freezing water just to feel alive again. When I finally crawled into bed, I couldn't sleep. For the first time in years, my mind wasn't circling old memories, it was imagining something new. The next morning, I woke to the soft light of dawn spilling through the curtains. The city outside was still asleep under a blanket of snow. And for once, I didn't feel invisible. Somewhere deep down, I knew I had already crossed a line I could never uncross. Next Christmas would not find me sitting in this apartment, scrolling through photos of people pretending I didn't exist. Next Christmas, I would not be forgotten. Next Christmas, I would be somewhere else entirely. And though I didn't know it then, that decision, to leave everything behind and start over, would change more than just my address. It would change the way I saw love, family, and myself forever. The drive to the mountains felt like escaping gravity itself. The farther I went, the smaller the city became behind me, a shrinking blur of lights and noise dissolving into mist. My old life fit neatly into 3 boxes in the back seat, some clothes, a few books, and a journal that had absorbed years of silence. Everything else I left behind without looking back. The road wound through forests heavy with snow. Pines stood like sentinels, tall and solemn, their branches sagging under white weight. The air changed as I climbed higher, thinner, cleaner, colder. I rolled down the window for a moment and let the wind slap against my face, sharp enough to make my eyes water. It was the kind of cold that woke you up, that reminded you were still alive. When I first saw the house, it barely looked like one. More like an old wooden box tucked between trees, smoke curling faintly from a crooked chimney. The roof was uneven, the porch sagged, and the steps creaked when I tested them. It wasn't much to look at. But standing there, surrounded by quiet and snow and sky, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. Inside, the air smelled of pine and dust. A single fireplace sat against the far wall, blackened from years of use. The windows were streaked, the furniture sparse. I remember standing in the middle of that empty living room, my breath clouding the air and whispering, "You'll do." It was strange how easily I settled into solitude. The first few nights, I built fires badly, burning more paper than wood. I slept wrapped in blankets, listening to the groans of the house adjusting to wind. There was no traffic, no chatter, no proof of the world beyond the trees. It terrified me, and yet, I couldn't stop smiling. Days turned into a rhythm. I woke with the sun bleeding orange through the window, made coffee on a sputtering stove, and spent hours clearing snow or fixing small things: leaky pipes, broken latches, a door that wouldn't stay closed. My hands, and used to real work, blistered and bled. But every repair felt like reclaiming something the years had taken from me. At night, I'd sit by the fire and write in my journal. Sometimes about the house, sometimes about nothing. Other times, I wrote letters I'd never send: "Dear Mom, I bought a cabin," or "Dear Lily, the snow here glows blue at night." I'd fold them neatly and tuck them under the journal's cover, knowing no one would ever read them. Still, it felt like speaking to the world again. It was on one of those writing nights that I first saw him. The storm had rolled in quick, sheets of snow whipping across the porch, the world beyond the window fading to white. I'd stepped outside to secure the shutters when headlights cut through the snow, blinding for a second. A pickup truck pulled up the road, tires crunching through ice. A man climbed out, bundled in a dark coat and wool hat. He waved through the storm. "You must be the new owner," he called, voice muffled by the wind. I nodded, unsure whether to shout back or just smile. He approached, holding a bag of firewood. "Name's Evan Parker," he said, setting it on the porch. "I live a mile down the road. Thought you might need this before the storm gets worse." It was the first human voice I'd heard in weeks. I thanked him, and he grinned, a quick, easy smile that melted some of the awkwardness. His eyes were the gray of early morning, steady and kind. We talked for a few minutes, shouting over the wind. He told me the cabin had been empty for years. The last owner left after a landslide took part of the old fence. "It's a good spot, though," he said. "Quiet. Kind of place that keeps secrets." Something in that sentence lingered after he drove away. For days, I thought about him. Not romantically, not yet, just the way you think of someone who reminded you the world still existed. I'd gotten used to silence, and now his voice had filled a corner of it I didn't realize was hollow. The snow piled higher that week. I chopped wood in the mornings, the axe echoing through trees. Sometimes, I'd catch the faint trace of smoke from his direction, a reassurance that someone else was out there. A few days later, a knock startled me. I opened the door to find Evan again, this time with a toolbox. "You've got a broken pipe," he said, nodding toward the side of the cabin. "Heard the water running from the trail." He worked quietly, his breath visible in the cold air. I stood beside him, passing tools when he asked. There was no judgment in his tone, no questions about why someone like me was living alone on a mountain. Just small talk about weather, books, and how city people never learn to fix anything. When the pipe was fixed, I offered him coffee. He hesitated, then accepted. Inside, we sat by the fire, steam curling from our mugs. For the first time in a long while, I felt the warmth of another presence, without the weight of expectation. He noticed the stack of journals by the chair. "You write?" "Sometimes," I said. "Mostly just thoughts I don't know where else to put." He nodded like he understood exactly what I meant. That night, after he left, I wrote about him, just a line or two. "Met someone today. Feels like the mountain finally spoke back." Weeks passed like that. Snowstorms, repairs, coffee by the fire. The loneliness I'd carried for years began to soften, replaced by quiet curiosity. I learned to chop wood properly. Learned that silence could be a friend, not a punishment. One evening, I stood outside and looked down the valley. The world below was smudged in twilight, the air sharp with pine. I realized that I hadn't thought about my family in days. Not because I'd forgotten them, but because, for once, they weren't the center of my story. That realization felt like breathing clean air for the first time. When I went inside, the firelight flickered across the walls, making the house feel alive. My home. My life. Mine. As I settled into bed that night, I thought of Evan's words again, the kind of place that keeps secrets. I didn't know it yet, but that mountain held more than just my silence. It was where I'd soon learn the difference between being alone and being found. Winter deepened until the world turned white and silent, like the mountain itself was holding its breath. Days blurred into one another, snowfall, firelight, the rhythmic creak of the cabin settling into the cold. I had grown used to my solitude, almost comfortable with it, until Evan began showing up more often. It started innocently. He'd drop by with groceries when the road iced over, or with spare tools when he suspected something might break again. Each time, he lingered just long enough to share a cup of coffee or fix a loose hinge before heading back down the trail. I told myself it was nothing, just neighborly kindness, but his presence began to carve a space in my days that hadn't existed before. One afternoon, the storm outside was fierce enough to rattle the windows. Evan appeared again, knocking on the door with snow dusting his coat and hair. "Road's blocked," he said, stamping his boots. "Mind if I waited out here for a bit?" I didn't. I stepped aside, and he crossed the threshold like he'd done it 100 times before. The fire crackled, casting a honey-colored glow on his face. For a while, we just sat there, listening to the wind scream against the cabin. "You've made this place yours," he said, glancing around the small room. "When I first saw it, I thought it'd swallow you whole. Guess I was wrong." "I had to learn," I said, smiling faintly. You either become friends with the mountain or you go mad. He laughed, that easy, warm sound that seemed to melt through even the thickest cold. Then his eyes fell on the journal sitting beside my chair, the one I always kept near. You write a lot, he said quietly. Letters, I think. You never send them, do you? I hesitated. No. They're just pieces of things I can't say out loud. He nodded slowly. You know, he said after a pause, there's an old custom around here. People used to write letters they never mailed and burn them in the fireplace. They said the smoke carried the words somewhere safe. Something about that lingered in the air between us, fragile and sacred. I opened the journal and flipped through the pages, letters to no one, fragments of thoughts I'd buried in ink. Without really deciding, I tore one page out. My handwriting looked like another person's. I folded it once, twice, then dropped it into the fire. The paper curled, blackened, and vanished in seconds. Feels strange, I murmured. Like watching a ghost disappear. Evan smiled faintly. Maybe it's not disappearing. Maybe it's finding a place to rest. From that night on, the ritual became ours. Every time he visited, we'd write something, sometimes a letter, sometimes a thought, and watch it burn. We didn't ask questions, didn't pry about what the other wrote. The fire kept our secrets. As the weeks passed, our conversations grew deeper, unguarded. I told him about the family that stopped calling, about the years I spent waiting for invitations that never came. I didn't name the word intersex at first. I just described the feeling of being seen as something neither side knew how to claim. He didn't interrupt. He didn't shift uncomfortably or rush to offer sympathy. He just listened, eyes steady, as if I were telling him a story worth hearing. When I finally said the word out loud, he only nodded. You know, he said softly, I've spent my life being told I'm too much or not enough of something. Maybe we both just got tired of pretending to fit. It wasn't a confession of love, not yet, but something in the way he said it felt like recognition, the kind that runs deeper than attraction. We spent the following days clearing snow together, hiking through the woods when the weather allowed, and reading aloud from old paperbacks by the fire. The cabin that once felt too quiet now carried the echo of laughter and soft voices. Still, part of me was afraid to let it mean anything. I had been forgotten once. I didn't know if I could bear it again. One night, he brought me an envelope. Thought you might like this, he said. Inside was a letter written in neat cursive. Dear Taylor, thanks for the coffee, the conversation, and the way you look at the world like it still deserves a chance. It wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. I laughed softly. You're writing now? Just keeping up with tradition, he said, half smiling. You burn yours. I leave mine behind. After that, we started exchanging letters instead of just burning them. I'd find one tucked under my doormat or slipped between the pages of a book I'd lent him. Some were simple, small details about the day, a poem he liked, a line about the smell of rain. Others were quiet reflections, things neither of us dared say aloud. It became our language, the written kind that didn't need eye contact to feel real. And yet, beneath the comfort, I could feel something shifting. The mountain had begun to thaw, and so had I. But with that warmth came fear, the kind that creeps in when happiness feels borrowed. One evening, as the last snow of the season fell, we sat beside the fire, the air thick with unspoken things. Evan was quieter than usual, tracing the rim of his mug. I've been thinking, he said finally, eyes fixed on the flames, about what it means to stay, to belong somewhere. You ever think maybe the mountain isn't meant to keep us forever? The words unsettled me. I wanted to ask if he was leaving, but the question stuck in my throat. Instead, I said, maybe belonging isn't about staying. Maybe it's about being remembered. He looked at me then, something unreadable in his gaze. Then I hope you know, he said softly, you'll be remembered. That night, after he left, I sat by the fire long after it died down. The house felt too quiet again. I found one last letter tucked beneath the lamp, just 3 words, you saved me. I held it for a long time before adding my own beneath it. You found me. Then I placed both into the fire. The flames rose gently, gold against the dark, carrying the words somewhere beyond reach. I watched until only ashes remained, wondering what exactly we were to each other, friends, healers, or something in between. The snow outside kept falling, soft and endless, burying the road that led down the mountain. I had no way of knowing that soon those roads would open again, and with them, an invitation I thought would never come. Spring crept into the mountains like a slow apology. The snow melted into clear streams that sang through the valley, and the trees shed their icy armor to reveal a deeper shade of green. The cabin smelled of pine and ash, the ghosts of winter still lingering in the corners. I had started to believe that my life here, quiet, steady, shared in fragments with Evan, might be enough. But peace, I've learned, doesn't last forever. It waits until your guard is down before reminding you what you've left behind. The email came one morning in late April. I was sipping coffee on the porch, watching mist drift through the trees, when my phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a name I hadn't seen in years, Lily Reed. My sister. I stared at it for a long time before opening the message. "Hey Tay," it began, casual in a way that made my chest tighten. Mom wanted me to reach out. "We're planning to have everyone home for Christmas this year, first time in a long while. She asked if I could check whether you'd want to come. Everyone misses you." I read it twice, then a third time. The words were simple, almost harmless, but they carried the weight of every silence that had come before. Everyone misses you. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. If they had missed me, why had I spent so many years waiting by a phone that never rang? When Evan found me later that morning, I was still sitting on the porch, the phone heavy in my hand. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, dropping a basket of wild mushrooms on the table. "Maybe I have," I murmured, passing him the phone. He read the message quietly, his brow furrowing just slightly. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I don't know," I said. Part of me wants to delete it and pretend it never came. Another part of me, I stopped, searching for words. Another part wants to know if it's real this time. Evan sat beside me, the morning light catching in his hair. "You don't owe anyone your pain," he said softly. "But you might owe yourself some peace." I looked at him then, realizing how much he had become my compass in this solitude. He never told me what to do, only helped me find the courage to decide. That night, I couldn't sleep. The mountain was too quiet, the stars too bright. My mind kept circling the same questions. What if they've changed? What if they haven't? What if forgiveness isn't possible, but I need to try anyway? By dawn, I'd made my choice. I packed a small bag, nothing more than clothes, a few old letters, and the courage I'd built here among the trees. Evan offered to drive me down the mountain. I hesitated, then nodded. The drive back felt unreal. The closer we got to town, the heavier the air became. Familiar roads appeared like ghosts, unchanged and indifferent. My family's house looked exactly as it always had, the same white fence, the same porch swing, the same wreath that probably hadn't been replaced in years. It was as if time had moved on without me, and yet stood perfectly still. My mother opened the door. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Her face had aged lines deeper, hair grayer, but her eyes were the same, uncertain and searching. "Taylor," she said finally, my name cracking on her tongue. "Hi, Mom." She stepped aside, letting me in. The house smelled of cinnamon and lemon cleaner, the scent of my childhood. Every wall, every framed photo was a memory preserved in glass. My sister appeared next, smiling too wide, her arms wrapping around me as though she could erase the years with one gesture. "It's been too long," she whispered. "Yeah," I said. "It has." Dinner that night was careful, almost rehearsed. Every conversation tiptoed around the truth, circling safe topics, weather, work, the mountain. My father said little, his fork clinking softly against his plate. The silence between us was a living thing, growing heavier with every minute. At one point, my mother reached for the wine and said, "We've missed you, you know." It hasn't been the same. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to reach across the table and tell her how many nights I had imagined hearing those words. But all I could think of was the empty chair that had waited for me every Christmas I spent alone. After dinner, I walked out to the porch, the air heavy with the scent of spring rain. My mother joined me after a moment, her voice soft behind me. "You've built a life, haven't you?" "I have," I said. "I'm glad," she whispered. I wish I'd known how to be part of it." I turned to her, surprised by the honesty in her tone. You still can, I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. She nodded slowly, eyes glistening. I want to try. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. When I left the next morning, my family stood on the porch waving, small and distant. I drove in silence, the road winding back toward the life I had chosen. The sun broke through the clouds as we reached the first ridge, bathing the valley in gold. Evan glanced over at me. How do you feel? He asked. Lighter, I said after a pause. Not because everything's fixed, but because I finally stopped waiting for them to fix it. He smiled, one of those quiet smiles that said everything words couldn't. Then maybe you're ready for your real home now. I looked out over the mountains, the peaks rising like old friends in the distance. For the first time, the past didn't feel like a chain. It felt like a story, one that had finally found its ending. As the cabin came into view again, smoke curling from the chimney, I felt something warm settle in my chest. The family I had left behind might never understand me completely, but I had found something pure here, acceptance without condition, peace without permission. When we stepped inside, the air smelled of wood smoke and something sweet. Evan had left a pot of cider simmering before we left. I smiled at him. You really did think I'd come back. I knew you would, he said. You just needed to remember who you were walking home to. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the mountain's soft breathing through the window, I thought of my mother's eyes, my sister's awkward laughter, the way forgiveness had felt like a fragile flame between us. Maybe it would flicker out again someday. Maybe it wouldn't. But for now, it was enough. I turned toward the faint glow of the fireplace and whispered to myself, I'm home. And though I didn't know it then, the next Christmas, the one waiting just beyond the horizon, would bring a warmth I had never imagined. The first snow of December arrived earlier than expected, soft and silent, blanketing the mountain in white. The cabin looked like something out of a forgotten dream, lights spilling from the windows, smoke rising gently from the chimney, and pine trees bowed under the weight of snow. I stood by the window, mug in hand, watching flakes dance against the glass. It was Christmas Eve. My first Christmas without pretending to be someone else, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel forgotten. Evan was in the kitchen humming off-key, wearing an apron far too cheerful for the season. The scent of roasted apples and cinnamon filled the air. You keep watching that snow like it's gonna tell you a secret, he teased, setting down a tray of cookies shaped like stars. Maybe it will, I said, smiling faintly. It feels like the mountain knows something I don't. He laughed, brushing flour off his hands. Maybe it knows this is your year. I wanted to believe that. I really did. Yet a quiet ache lingered inside me, a shadow of old Decembers, of family tables I never sat at, of laughter that always seemed to echo from somewhere far away. But now, the silence around me felt different. It wasn't loneliness anymore. It was peace. We'd spent the last few weeks preparing for this day, decorating the cabin with pine garlands, hanging paper ornaments by the fire, even finding an old radio that still played Christmas classics with a faint crackle. Every small thing had meaning now. Every detail was ours. That evening, as dusk settled over the valley, Evan lit the fire while I strung the last few lights around the window. The glow painted the walls with gold, flickering against the wood. I took a deep breath, the warmth sinking into my bones. This, I said quietly, is what I always imagined Christmas could feel like. Evan turned toward me, his expression soft. Then it's exactly what it should be. The knock on the door came just as the music faded into silence. I froze. Evan looked up, curious, wiping his hands on a towel. Expecting someone? He asked. No, I said slowly. My pulse quickened. When I opened the door, the world outside seemed to hold its breath. There, standing on the porch in thick coats dusted with snow, were my mother and sister. Lily smiled nervously, holding a small box wrapped in gold paper. My mother looked unsure, her gloved hands twisting together. Hi, Taylor, she said, her voice trembling slightly. We didn't want to spend another Christmas wondering how you were doing. I just stood there stunned. For a moment, I couldn't speak. All I could see was the memory of empty holidays, the ache of years spent in silence. And now, they were here on my mountain at my door. Evan appeared behind me, his presence steady. He didn't say anything, just placed a hand lightly on my shoulder. That small gesture grounded me. "Come in," I said finally. My voice was soft but sure. "It's cold out there." They stepped inside, eyes wandering over the cabin, the tree, the fire. Lily smiled as she looked around. "It's beautiful here." "Peaceful." "It's home," I said. We sat by the fire, an awkward quiet settling over us at first. Evan poured cider into cups, the warm spice filling the room. My mother cradled hers, staring at the steam. "I used to make this for you when you were little," she said quietly. "I remember," I replied. "It was my favorite." Something shifted then, small, delicate, like a crack in ice letting light through. Lily reached into her coat and handed me the box. Inside was an ornament, hand-painted with a snowy cabin that looked uncannily like mine. "We thought maybe it belonged here," she said. My throat tightened. "Thank you," I whispered. Evan stood and gently hung the ornament on the tree. "There," he said, smiling. "Now it's complete." The night stretched on in quiet conversation. My mother spoke about small things, the neighbors, the church choir, her garden that refused to grow lavender. Lily told stories about her kids, who had apparently seen a picture of my cabin and called it a fairy house. Every story felt like a bridge being rebuilt, plank by plank. At one point, my mother looked at me, her eyes shimmering in the firelight. "You look happy," she said softly. "I am," I told her. For a long time, I wasn't sure I'd ever say that truthfully. She nodded, tears catching in her lashes. "I'm sorry it took me so long to see you for who you are." "I'm sorry it took me so long to stop waiting for you to," I replied gently. The silence that followed wasn't painful. It was full of understanding, of release, of something like forgiveness. When they left the next morning, the snow was falling again. I walked them to their car, the cold biting at my cheeks. My mother hugged me, tightly this time, like she was afraid to let go. "Come visit us sometime," she said. "You don't have to stay away anymore." I smiled. "I will." Lily waved as they drove away, their car disappearing down the winding road. I stood there for a long while, watching until the last trace of them was gone. Then I turned back toward the cabin, the warm light glowing through the windows, the faint sound of music still playing inside. Evan met me at the door, holding 2 mugs of cider. "So," he said, handing me one, "how does it feel, your first real Christmas?" I looked around at the cabin, the snow, the ornament glinting on the tree. I thought of the girl I used to be, the one waiting for an invitation that never came, and the person I had become, who built her own place in the world instead. "It feels like coming home," I said. We sat by the fire that night, watching the snow fall beyond the window, the air rich with quiet gratitude. For once, I didn't feel like the forgotten one. I felt seen, whole, and free. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the sound of laughter and memory into the night. And as I leaned my head against Evan's shoulder, I realized something simple but powerful sometimes. Family isn't the one you're born into. It's the one that shows up when the world forgets you. The fire crackled softly, and I whispered to the mountain, "Thank you." It didn't answer, but I swear, in that moment, I felt it listening.